Okay, welcome everyone to the what are we calling this again? Every time
Minding emotions.
Minding Emotions podcast. Every time we do this, I forget the name of it. Well, it's kind of not our fault. I want to blame other people as usual. We've been having a series of conversations about the emotions from the point of view of psychology and philosophy. I think many listeners, viewers are familiar with the stuff we've been doing. This, like every other episode, can stand alone, but also if you're interested, go back and see some of our other conversations where we go sort of more fine-grained on some of these topics. The reason why I can't get the name right is because we have this book coming out with Harvard next year, and we've been debating what's the name of the book, and so now we finally have a name of the book, and it is
The Emotional Mind.
The Emotional Mind. Subtitle is The Affective Roots of Culture and Cognition. Am
That's
I right?
it.
All right.
That's it.
All right. So keep your eye out for that, folks, and we'll try to get the names straight here eventually. So as usual, we're focusing on some particular aspect of the emotions, and today we're going to be talking about some great work by neuroscientist Kent Berridge, and also some excellent work in a new book by Antonio Demasio. Damasio's book here is called The Strange Order of Things, and it just came out, I think, a couple months ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so we want to start the conversation by talking about what is pleasure, what is, and does it contrast with desire or craving or wanting? And so maybe let's just start out with a general sort of discussion about what is the nature of pleasure and how is it conceptualized in psychology and in culture.
Yeah, I guess we could start, the older discussion, which is the Epicurean discussion about hedonism. And I guess that discussion was, what is the purpose of life? Is the purpose of life pleasure? And so it was the idea of, Epicurus was saying, well, pleasure means getting things balanced. It means not having too much, not having too little. You get satiated if you take too much stuff in. That was sort of the old discussion about pleasure in the general sense. What's the purpose of life? And recently, I've been speaking with my students, and we were talking about how do they get hooked on these phones. And talking about sort of the pleasure cycle of the pop-up.
Yeah.
This thing pops up, that pops up, this idea, that person said this, and they're kind of constantly in this state of getting pleasure or almost getting pleasure or on the trail of pleasure. So we have a different notion now. We have this notion of pleasure as getting towards something. We have the notion of pleasure as consuming objects, buying things. We have pleasure in sexual domains and sort of the larger shift in how we talk about sexual pleasure in this culture. And then we have this sort of nitty-gritty neuroscience of pleasure that we're going to talk about here, about the sort of the there's a discussion in the wider culture about dopamine and serotonin. Those neurotransmitters have kind of gotten out, and people want to reduce it to that. That happens a lot. So there's all these dimensions that we could get into.
Yeah, one of the things that I know that people who study the brain are getting sick of hearing about dopamine because it, like you said, it's gotten out into the popular culture. But one of the things we're going to talk about today is this really exciting, alternative theory, sort of developed by Kent Berridge, that it may not be dopamine.
Berridge and Robinson.
Yeah, right, Berridge and Robinson. Terry Robinson and Kent Berridge at University of Michigan. They think it's not that dopamine is crucial, but it's not the thing that's causing the pleasure. So we'll get to this in a little bit. But I want to stick with where you started, which is sort of with the question about hedonism, and in the ancient world, it's if you look at Plato's Republic or Aristotle, Aristotle's De Anima is a good example too. This is about Aristotle's theory of the soul, but both of them sort of toyed with what's the sort of a faculty theory of the psyche that, and they carve it up a little different depending on who you're talking to. But in Plato's Republic, he says, well, there's a kind of faculty for feeling pleasure, and that he calls this, he calls this the appetites. The Greek word for this is epithumia, epithemia, and in the Republic, he considers it sort of the lowest level of the soul, like it's the basement.
The glutton.
Yeah, the glutton. So if you let the pleasure, the capacity for pleasure rule your soul, that faculty rule your soul, then you become like a glutton or like a madman or something.
Mm-hmm.
But then, and then of course he's got reason, which both, most of the Greeks and the Romans agree that reason has to sort of control the appetites. But then there's this mediating middle territory in Plato's psychology and in Aristotle's, which is, Plato calls it thumos.
Thumos,
Yeah.
emotion.
Yeah, so we translate it as emotion, but it's sort of like drive.
Passion.
Yeah, passion, motivation. And then Aristotle comes along and uses the word orexis to sort of describe something similar. But for Aristotle, who's always a little more physiological and biological in his approach, he's thinking this is the part of the soul or the psyche that moves you towards a goal state. So perception would feel good, or pleasures and appetites feel good, but you need something to move you towards those things. And that's kind of exciting.
Yeah, and this kind of, I was reading something somewhere about this, or Nico Friesda, the Dutch psychologist. He was talking about, we're talking about emotions all the time, but we forgot about the notion of passion.
Right.
That there's this oversweeping thing that emotions are supposed to do, and that's the traditional way of talking about, at least with the Greeks, that it's got a drive thing to it too. And I wonder how much that's worked into our conversation about pleasure. How much of passion is actually pleasurable? How much of it is torturous? There's also that thing in Plato that you're being tortured by these animals. These animals are bringing in things you don't want to bring in. So the drive, we've talked about this drive, the sort of seeking drive or the drive to engage with the world, but the passion drive has a little bit, it has good connotations insofar as we have these notions of follow your passion, or that's what I'm passionate about. But it also has these things, a lot of this domestic abuse we have in society is pushed by passion, or crimes of passion, or people being too attached or attached in weird ways in their passions.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we've changed the meaning of passion in the 20th and 21st century, because I think you're right. When we talk about passion nowadays, we're talking about like ambition, aggression, something that goes out into the world, like you're characterizing. But historically, if you think about modern philosophy like Descartes, Spinoza, and all the way back to the Greeks, the passions would have been when you're not active, the thing is happening to you.
Passive.
Yeah, and in a way, like, if you look at Spinoza's psychology, he's trying to get you to convert your passions into actions.
Yeah.
And I think we use passion to mean action, and they had a more nuanced maybe view of it, where the stuff that overcomes you and pushes you around, like lust, they thought that you're now subject to it, and you need to sort of take hold of it and transform it into something where you have agency over it. And that's what makes it from a passion into an action. So, yeah, I think that's part of our conversation nowadays, too. Because you're right, I think you hear people talk about their vocations and why do you go to college, follow your passion, follow your bliss. And so we don't even think of strong emotions as negative. We just think, bring it on. We're sort of
the more
like,
intense
the
3D movie,
right.
King Kong 10.
Yeah, exactly. Like everything should just be turned up as much as possible. And but this is interesting. It's an interesting issue that you started out with, because you're talking about your students and their phones and digital technology. And it's almost like, I can think about when I was a kid, we didn't have any of this stuff. Now we had TV, which also made us sort of zombies and people worried about it,
Hmm.
true. But oftentimes what you were trying to do with culture was try to stop the hedonism problem. You have a tendency to pursue things that are pleasurable, whether it's like, ice cream or sex or whatever. And in a way, the cultural project is to get you to have like impulse control.
Yeah.
And now it's almost like the next generation, millennials and Generation Z, they have this kind of not so much the hedonism problem, but they have a kind of they're deeply distracted. It's like one thing here, one thing there, one thing here, one thing there, and it seems like things like mindful meditation um, are attempts to try to get the mind to stop jumping. Like you said, this pops up, this pops up, this pops up, and the mind is just in this, what Buddhists call the monkey mind syndrome.
Yeah, I guess it is important to bring in Buddhism and the other contemplative traditions because there is something about denying the passions in those
Right.
traditions, right? The Buddha is saying, you have to know that you're feeling passion because of this and because of that, and to sort of know what's going on. And I guess, and sometimes we talk about passion as not knowing, or the sort of the being thrown into it. I mean, it's related to this passive active thing we're talking about too. Do you seek pleasure? Does pleasure ever just come to you,
Hmm.
you know?
Hmm.
Or is it always some sort of um, reward for a set of actions or an organized plan or something like that?
Yeah, and what's the relationship between that that organized action, that teleological action, and then these pleasure states? Because this, I think, has been the main confusion in psychology, which is the assumption was, well, that that action plan, that teleological goal-driven behavior, is really just about the pleasure
Yeah.
and is in a way inseparable from the rewards. And what we're learning now in the neuroscience of the last 10 or 20 years is that actually they're separate systems. So maybe let me just say a word or two about Buddhism, and then maybe we can get to this argument that of Berridge and Robinson. Um, I think this is a good point. Buddhism, it speaks to a lot of people because of this problem of distraction and problem of passion. Um, but what's interesting about Buddhism is that if you look at the original teachings of like the Pali Tripitaka, that's the oldest stuff that we have. This is sort of what I would call the more rational Buddhism, where it's really more like a psychology theory. And then this is Theravada Buddhism, basically. And after Theravada comes the more imaginative Buddhism of Mahayana, which is probably more familiar to people, filled with all kinds of magical stuff. But if you look at that old Buddhism, there's some wonderful passages. Like he says, well, when you feel pleasure, like let's say you eat something really great or you have some great sex, he says you get hit with two darts.
Mm.
The first dart is like that immediate stimulation, like, God, that feels really wonderful. But then the second dart is the what would be the craving dart. This is what makes you want to hold on to that feeling even as it's passing out of your system. So, like every kind of pleasure, it's only transient and temporary. And as it starts to move out of your system, you go clawing after it, you know.
Hmm.
That's the second dart, and that's what the Buddha calls. That's where he has a technical term, craving, which in Pali is the word is tanha, and it's not just feeling good or pleasure. It's like a kind of addictive or compulsive,
Hmm.
attitude towards that pleasure.
And this reminds me of Schopenhauer. So I was just reading
Oh yeah.
on the suffering of life, and he's saying, well, every time you have a pleasure, it's just the absence of suffering.
Oh,
It's just a little bit absence of suffering. And there's also the whole tradition of the pessimists and the cynical philosophers that it's ephemeral. Any pleasure is ephemeral. Whenever you get the thing, you'll realize that you want something else later.
right.
There's so this idea of the teleology is actually is one of the illusions of our psychology, I guess you could say. But it's also one of the illusions um, of mortality in a way.
Yeah, that I mean that's interesting. You bring up Schopenhauer because he so many philosophers don't know what to do with the will. You know,
Hmm.
they either push it on the side of the emotions or they push it on the side of cognition. It's either on the body side or it's mental.
Hmm.
And he puts it like right at the center of his whole philosophy. You know, the
Yeah.
world is will and representation. And I think most people don't follow the metaphysical dimension of this, although some might. Maybe when we get to Demasio, we could connect some dots here. Um, but certainly it's at the core of his psychology. And, you know, I guess Freud was deeply influenced by Schopenhauer and said, well, I'm doing a kind of Schopenhauerian view of human nature without all the metaphysics, just talking like a psychology.
Well, the will is essentially striving. In
Yeah.
every creature, the will is striving out into the world. And then you hear this in Nietzsche with becoming, the notion of everything is becoming and
Mm.
going into the world. So there is something there similar to our idea of driving towards pleasure. I guess in a way it's gotten hijacked. Like what's this notion we have of the will now? You try to have success. We have this capitalist model of success.
Mm.
Um, we have some language of self-actualization. We've talked a little bit about self-help and this whole language striving towards. And we have Maslow and his
Mm.
notion of what do you need? What are you really driving towards? But Schopenhauer, it wasn't driving towards anything but staying alive. Remember,
Yes,
his
right.
initial passage is that everything is trying to stay alive, and that's what its will is.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I think he has some wonderful examples too of like wherever you look,
Yeah,
nature is manifesting, just breaking through the sidewalk cement and and so yeah, this is we've talked about Spinoza's Conatus in our discussions before, and it's kind of fun that Schopenhauer is now in the mix of the conversation. I know that if you think what Schopenhauer did, if you look at him in the history of philosophy, he's coming sort of off the the tail end of the Kantian revolution, and so Kant says, well, once you realize that there's a kind of subjective structure that the mind supplies to reality and gives us a kind of mediates that reality, whether it's like the concepts of understanding like cause and effect or the big categories like space and time. These are features of the mind, according to Kant. And then reality is meeting, our perceptual and our cognitive faculties and coming through that extruder, is what we think of as reality.
hmm
And then if you ask Kant, well, what is reality independent of these conceptual categories that we're mediating with our minds, he would have said, well, we can't say. That's the Ding
thing
an
in
sich,
itself.
yeah, the
Yeah.
thing in itself. And then along comes Schopenhauer and he says, I'll tell you what it is.
The will, yeah.
Yeah, it's the will. So it's kind of fun. This is why I always like Schopenhauer, is that he broke through that kind of careful skepticism that Kant had about the thing in itself, and just said it's the will.
And Hegel too. He was
Yeah, right.
directly saying Hegel is baloney, all this sort of huge metaphysical stuff. It's just creatures trying to stay alive.
Yeah, and in a way, it's almost like even though Schopenhauer is rarely taught these days in philosophy programs. I mean, they throw him in the history sequence. You get him in your 19th
Aesthetics
century
or
class,
something.
yeah, or you get him in aesthetics. But in a way, his worldview almost fits better with a Darwinian metaphysics
Uh-huh.
than some of the other philosophers like Hegel.
Yeah.
I think because Hegel was so important to Marx and to political realities. He's more celebrated, but in a way, I think Schopenhauer is more consistent with our view of nature,
Uh-huh.
although very pessimistic. Anyway, so let's tie this then to this recent work then, which is empirical work in the lab, and we had the good fortune to meet and talk with Berridge, I guess maybe 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, we went to the Society for Philosophy and Psychology meeting over in Ann Arbor.
Right, and that was really fun, and we saw what the state of the field is, and it's a little depressing, but there's there's some good stuff going on, including most importantly, this work by Berridge, which is just dynamite. So how should we set it up? You want to just sort of talk through the different brain systems, or how do you want to do it?
Yeah, I guess we can break it down. So we're talking about pleasure, and the common way of thinking about pleasure is that your um, your body is trying to get into a good state. You're trying to feel good, and this can happen in all kinds of ways. And we have this whole notion about going out to eat. Going to achieve the pleasure, the consummatory um, pleasure. Um, but we also all know that once you feel the pleasure, then it goes down, and the dart of craving happens, and the new search for something better starts to happen. That's part of what I think this sort of internet pop-up thing is, looking for something better, looking for the next best thing. Um, but I can start it off like that, and then we can get into the details.
Okay, good. Yeah, this I'd heard this work before from lots of other people, particularly like Robert Sapolsky had talked about the fact that you would expect the rise of dopamine to basically crescendo at the point of consummatory
Yeah,
reward, and
yeah,
yet it actually crescendos before that moment and then declines as you have the reward. And that what Sapolsky's talking about there is this work that Berridge and Robinson created, which is they were able to show that dopamine seems to be driving what they call the wanting system.
hmm
And this wanting system is basically ramped up by an increase in dopamine. And then at the end of this, you get a pleasurable experience, and he calls that liking. So he makes a distinction between wanting and liking something. And
yeah,
he says, like in popular culture, we don't really make this distinction, but he says in the brain, they're really two different systems.
yeah. And one of his best points for this is that people who are addicted to things, drugs is the easiest one to study, but any sort of addiction, you want something, but you don't necessarily like it.
Yeah,
So a lot of drug addiction is about this need to get that thing and get it, even though you know it's ruining your relationships and you know where it's going to go. You don't like it. You don't like it, but you need it or you want it.
yeah. I think that's a great. I mean, a lot of his work now is on addiction, and addiction is something where you can see this very clearly because most of us, it's like the wanting and the pleasure usually go together, or they come together at some point. But you're right. It's pretty clear that when you become addicted to a drug, let's say, or a behavior,
Or a person.
or a person, you can dislike the person, you can dislike the experience you're having, and yet you still find yourself on this terrible trajectory.
Yeah.
And so he says this is the term he uses here is a incentive a sensitization theory of addiction.
Yeah. Well,
Sorry.
yeah. Let me add one thing here. So we're talking about this liking and wanting. I'll just add one more piece. Is why do we keep doing it then? There's also an element he talks about called learning. We're also, and this is Aristotelian, that we get into these habits, and then these habits, they might be bodily things, or they might be sort of larger narratives that we're hooking onto. The narrative of how good this is, or the narrative of how long our love lasted. There's all these narratives. So there's also a learning thing going on, and they do emphasize that.
Yeah, one of the things that he seems to be isolating is the importance of these like cues that
Yeah,
in
that's
your
the hard
pathway,
part.
and this like narrative of your pleasure or the thing you're pursuing. Like, let's talk about that a little bit. Like in drug addiction, it's not just the substance you're after, right? Or it's not what you're obsessing on. Like, what else is going on?
Well, so in the conference there was a panel on addiction, and one of the people speaking was Dr. Marc Broussard, I think his name was, and he was talking about how there's these narratives that we either build or we're working out those narratives. Like, um, it's sort of a game of language or grammatical games that we start to enact.
Mm,
That can be a cue too. Like there's cues of like, oh, there's that bar I used to go to,
mm.
or that song reminds me of this substance or whatever like that. But there's also larger narratives like, oh, I'm hooked, or
Ah.
um, it's only fun when this happens. Those kinds of things, and then you play out those narratives. You see?
Yeah, yeah, that's actually a close friend of mine has an addiction problem, and he says, well, there is a kind of narrative that he would tell himself, which was something like, I'm sure it's a little different for everybody, but in his case, it was like, I'm working so damn hard this week that I deserve to just have the lost weekend. And
Uh-huh.
that getting utterly blitzed and annihilated was part of this like heroic narrative that he had, which was he's been incredibly disciplined and working incredibly hard, and now he's got to basically. I'm sorry, all my devices are like no longer silenced because of this other thing, and now he's going to have this the incredible reward. And in a way, the addiction is part of this story that he would tell himself every week.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of
Yeah,
addictions.
speaking of addictions. All right, so yeah, there's this problem of what's cueing the drive. Like I need my fix, whether it's alcohol or cocaine or sex, and so these cues become very important to Berridge and Robinson.
Yeah, and this other person on the panel, her name I think was Peg Murphy. Peg, I forgot her last name, but she was talking about it as sort of a Wittgensteinian language game that we get into.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that we play out these narratives as language games.
That sounds way too cognitive to me. Like that requires. I mean, maybe it's right, but it seems like the thing that Berridge and Robinson are talking about is that in a way it's almost like conditioning cues. You see something like that is your old friend who you used to fix with, and
Yeah,
it's basically triggering you at the unconscious level, not at the conscious level.
yeah,
So it could be narratives as well, but also something else is going on at the purely conditioned level. Am I right?
yeah, definitely. I mean, we know this from, for example, um, if you're most overdoses, not most overdoses, but a lot of overdoses are when the person is fixing in a place they haven't fixed before.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, because usually they have sort of a shooting place. And so when they're there, all those cues get the body into, okay, this big rush is going to come right now. This drug is coming. And then the body, some things change. But if they do it in a new place, same dosage, there's a better chance of overdose.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Is that because the cues of the environment are they're activating things, but they're also keeping the behavior within a certain level of
They're calibrated, the
I,
body's conditioned.
okay,
The body, meaning all the other things that are going on, gets conditioned to place conditioning, basically.
place conditioning. Okay,
Yeah.
so I guess is the argument here that there's certain people and their wanting system is simply either by experience or genetic disposition, they have a way of their wanting system is set higher than the average person.
Well, this is the thing, the unanswered question, which
Okay.
is a lot of people do drugs, but only about whatever 30%, 20 to
Yeah,
30%
I remember
become addicted,
30%. Yeah.
become addicted, and they don't know. I mean, there's no we can't like say this genetically is why. And some rats, same thing with rats, 20 to 30% just want that. The other ones are fine with socializing instead of taking the drug. So the question, what is the difference? But I don't think there's an answer about why those people stick.
There's one thing he reflects on is that there could be this difference between what he calls a goal tracker and a signal tracker. He says that some rats and some human beings, they come in to an environment, and let's say you've got like a hit of cocaine and you've got a button or a lever you have to press to get it. He said some animals, and I think he works mostly with rats, right, and mice. Uh, they'll be very they'll stay near the device or the button. They're sort of like they key in on it and they spend more time at that site, whereas others will go to the delivery site and spend more time where the
Yeah,
goal is delivered, like the cocaine, let's say.
right.
And he says that there might be two different kinds of dispositions in mammals like us, where some of us are really keyed into cues that lead to pleasure, and some of us are kind of have a sort of benign neglect toward the cues and focus more on the actual pleasure. And then he's just speculating here, but I remember he says, well, maybe that's why some people then are more activated by cues towards addiction and other people are not. It's kind of an interesting thesis.
Hmm. That is interesting. And I wonder how that ties into other things like anxiety. People
Oh,
with
yeah.
anxiety are usually more into like waiting for the cue and just there. Um, but when you're talking about now about the wanting system. So
Yeah.
he says there's wanting, liking, and then there's learning across them all. And the wanting one, you refer to the term incentive valiance,
Yeah.
incentive salience, and that's the idea that it's not for a particular thing. It's that anything becomes salient. Like your sort of whole looking for things disposition is turned up. And he's saying that sort of, and that this is the dopamine part. This is
Okay.
now we can talk about dopamine. Dopamine mesocortical limbic
Okay.
dopamine system.
So it's in the limbic system, and their projections, he says, that go forward to the
From the
frontal areas.
mesoencephalon, from down here up into the limbic, into the cortical.
Okay.
And that this is like the wanting. This is when you're excited about like something happens. You what we sometimes called seeking actually.
Oh, yeah,
You
that's
know, in our book we
Panksepp's.
called it
Yeah.
seeking.
Okay.
But Panksepp talks about seeking as goad without a goal,
Right.
and they're saying incentive salience, which means any sort of incentive is becomes more salient
But
during that
okay,
part.
so is it for Panksepp? It's more like a drive. It's pushing you out into the world. And
To
if I'm
enjoy.
hearing if I'm hearing Berridge and Robinson, it's more like a really peaked up sensitivity
Yeah,
instead of like. So now, like you said, everything's more salient,
yeah,
and that you can't say no to them. You can't sort of push them out of your sort of horizon of concern. They simply come in and push you in a certain way, I suppose, then towards addiction.
I mean, no, they don't say that. I mean, it's like your dopamine is going up, and so at that point, any little like once you start to get some dopamine going up, then even smaller, I think, incentives will.
Ah,
There's a bunch of dopamine in the whole system. So
okay.
anything now is going to start it's going to start hitting you as you start going up on this.
That's interesting, and it makes sense out of some of the empirical work that they did because one of there were a couple experiments that they've done that really shows you the divorce between the liking and the wanting system. Is he said they if you if you deplete the animal of dopamine, the animal still has pleasure when it eats sugars or sweets.
Hmm.
It demonstrates all the pleasures of the sweetness, but it has no drive to go and get the sweets because the
Hmm.
dopamine has been suppressed.
Right.
And they've done the same in human subjects too, where people will report, oh, yeah, the food is delicious, but if you deplete the dopamine, you have no actual like drive to go get it. There's no
Yeah.
craving for it.
Yeah. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
And Yeah, we've talked about this with, I mean, this is definitely in the culture that these, oh, my little dopamine burst. I'm getting it
Right.
like someone liked my stupid picture. Dopamine burst,
Yeah.
you know?
Oh, watch out!
It's
Your little microphone is rubbing on your shirt there and
okay.
creating a lot of.
Right. So all these things are little things that give you the dopamine burst. But I guess it looks like to me that that's what these companies, these Silicon Valley companies are doing. They're
Mm,
hooking on to the system, like and always having the right kind of burst that's kind of similar. You might like this, recommended for you. That's the whole point of all this, giving them the information so they can then give you the right stuff to keep you in the wanting thing and keep you on the machine
it's like a.
for I don't know what purpose.
It's not even a loop of pleasure. It's a loop of anticipation. Just
Anticipation.
anticipation over and over and over again. Every once in a
Yeah.
while, you get a little hit of like actual reward, but it doesn't matter. You can just keep people on this loop of anticipation.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Because once you have the consumatory or the orgasmic moment, then it goes, you're satiated.
Yes, right now. So that's so yeah. We've talked about this before with regard to Jaak Panksepp's work and also Damasio, which is their view is sort of homeostasis is really important. So when the system is ramped up and it gets satiated, it comes back down and resets at kind of
Yeah.
what do you want to call? I mean, homeostasis is the right
Yeah.
word, but maybe people would recognize it more as a kind of it's like a Goldilocks. It's not too hot, not too cold, not
Yeah.
too hungry, not too full. You're kind of in the middle, and the systems are always trying to reset to homeostasis. Um, One thing we should talk about though is that he says if dopamine is not the thing that's giving you pleasure or giving you the liking experience, then what is? And here he argues that it's endogenous opioids
That's right.
and endogenous cannabinoids. So maybe we should talk a little bit about that. That's different stuff.
Yeah, it's very interesting, this opioid thing. So we all have heard the word opioid. Opioid is one of um, is a set of neurotransmitters, basically three kinds of opioids. But one of them is pleasurable, one is kind of pleasurable, one is uh, dystopic, I guess. That's not the right word. Dysphoric. But we know that opioids, they have a role in pain relief. That's our major understanding of them, a role in pain relief. But it also has a euphoria and a pain relief, and it also makes you feel like nothing. It doesn't matter what happens. Everything is cool.
Everything's cool.
You get blissed. It's bliss.
Blissed out. Yeah. Okay,
It's
good.
total. It's a bliss thing, and you can see this. I've seen, if someone's in pain, very much pain, and then they get some opioid, you can just see their whole face relax, their whole body relax. It's this complete. Okay, doesn't matter. Everything's okay. So, anyways, this part where you like something, that's opioids. That's opioids that are doing that.
That is really, I think that's the message that needs to get out there. You know what I mean? Like people, well, I mean, we know that in a sense, but the fact that the feeling of pain relief and pleasure is actually the internal opioids triggering in what he calls hedonic hotspots. I thought this was a great
Yeah.
phrase. He says like it's in sort of more frontal areas where you see these little tiny areas
Yeah.
that light up during these really pleasurable experiences. And that's different from what he calls the more robust, pretty much it's sort of always the same, or at least it's very similar uh, projection of dopamine from these mesolimbic areas. That's the wanting, whereas these little hedonic hotspots are the pleasure, and they are in fact two separate systems. And I just find that very exciting. That I think in popular culture, what's happened is we know that opioids reduce pain, and we know they produce pleasure, but now we're sort of confusing dopamine and opioids together. Like we're saying, in popular imagination, it's sort of the same stuff, or it's the same thing.
Well, interestingly, these are the two. These are the two addictions of at least contemporary America. You have the phone addiction and the addiction for for this these machines, and then you have the opioid crisis
Right.
that's in this country too. I think we shouldn't ignore that. There's something going on there.
Yeah, your comment about maybe 30% of the population becomes addicted is really interesting because it makes me think of that study, which I don't know that much about it. I've only read sort of popular press versions of it. You probably know more, which is that originally when they did that test about the rat sort of mashing the cocaine button, it looked like the thing would do this no matter what, including foregoing its own feeding and sleeping, and it just coked itself to death. But
Right.
then my understanding is that they redid these experiments with a much richer environment. Did you
That's
follow
right.
that stuff? Like,
Yeah, if you put a rat in a richer environment, you give them that same cocaine pedal, but you also give it the chance to play on things or to interact socially. In that case, you only get about 30%, 20 to 30% who will just still do the cocaine thing. But in general, maybe it's even less than that. It's a pretty drastic difference.
really?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
go ahead.
yeah, we know this. We know this from addicts. If you give an addict sort of a dead end job and a impoverished environment, very little money, very little sense of dignity or freedom, that they're going to stay in that community of users. Um,
That makes sense. And it's I'd heard, I don't know if this is in Michael Pollan's new book on drugs and consciousness, or I can't remember where I heard this, but that there were a large number of American Vietnam vets who, well, while they were in active duty, were hooked on heroin. But when they returned, instead of thinking, I mean, I think Nixon's White House got ready for the return of a bunch of drug addicts. But in point of fact, when if vets could reenter a rich
yeah.
environment, family life, job, their addiction slipped away, and it was a much smaller number of actual addicted guys than we had expected. And but here's the troubling thing: is it's almost like there's a small subset, let's say it's 30% of the population, that is going to be addicted once they try cocaine or heroin or whatever it is, or alcohol. And that leaves the vast majority of people able to drink
Hmm.
alcohol without trouble, and I prove this nightly, but or to possibly do other substances without being hooked as an addict. The only
Hmm.
problem is, like, let's say you're a parent and you've got a kid. Is your kid going to be in that 30% who gets their lives ruined because they casually tried this substance, or are they going to be in the 70% that are just fine and can treat these substances with a kind of, you know,
That
casualness?
depends. I think it depends on a lot of other factors. I mean, that's still using the notion of, yeah, there's a gene for addiction. We have this notion, oh, I have an addictive personality.
Right.
And I guess there must be something to
Yeah, it
that,
might be true, you know?
but it's also all these other factors are intrinsic to what happens to the person,
Yeah.
uh, including the narratives that they're playing out. If they hear there's an addictive personality and you're one of those people, that's it, because they can just rehearse that game.
Yeah. Well, then what can be done? I know that there's been some attempts to inject people with, and I guess they're like,
Naloxone,
yeah. Can you explain this? It's like an opioid blocker of some kind
yeah,
with varying levels of success.
yeah, varying levels of success, but basically you can block the opioid receptors with naloxone or naltrexone, and uh, and so people can take the opioid but not get the thing they're looking for. And they do this with cigarettes. This is very common with cigarettes. Um, and I mean varying levels of success. Like you have to know it. All the other factors have to line up too.
Yeah, it
You
seems
can,
to me it won't work just based on what if we're arguing that it's not the opioid reward that's actually the true source of the addiction. So if you block opioids and you make the experience not very likable, if Berridge and Robinson are right, that sort of isn't going to help, because what needs to happen is that this wanting system has to be, in some sense, throttled or adjusted. Am I
But you
right?
can't. But that's the whole, like, if you take away that system, then you have no compulsion into the world.
Yeah, right.
So
which is why there are some drugs and pharmaceuticals that do kill this bigger drive, and it puts people sort of catatonic,
yeah,
and the nobody really wants that.
like for example, people with schizophrenia are given drugs to turn down dopamine because dopamine is helping create the psychotic
Oh,
symptoms.
oh,
And so you've seen some of these people, they come out with some version of Parkinson's, basically. Uh, that's the long-term effects of turning down dopamine. And you see in these institutions, they are zombified because their dopamine has been way turned down. That same system.
yeah, and this jives with what I've heard in terms of some theories about depression generally, that it's some kind of paucity or lack of dopamine, and that if that you might be able to adjust or raise dopamine levels and improve depression. At least I know that that's the views out there.
Well, the main view for depression is that there's a serotonin imbalance. That's what most of the medication is. Now they're starting to open it up into norepinephrine and dopamine in the last, whatever, 10 years. But in general, it's been looked at as a serotonin, because serotonin also, if you have depression, then you have to have sleep imbalance, weight fluctuation, um, um, these kind of
Okay.
somatic symptoms. And it looks like serotonin has a large role in that as well as mood.
Okay.
So that's why they isolated serotonin. But again, with depression, um, there have to be other things too. That's why we have people with depression taking also therapeutic courses to change their narrative of what's who they are, what the purpose is. See, like, we're human beings, we are. There's a way of reducing it to the biology, but um, the way in which our cultural lifeways translate into biology, I think, is not well understood. And furthermore, there's all this narrative that we're doing at all times as human beings, as humanist creatures.
Hmm.
We're doing all this other stuff, and um, that stuff requires more of that stuff. It requires more
Yeah.
engagement and linguistic, but also um,
Drive.
intellectual. Yeah, drive intellectual too. There's like all this thinking about what's going on that people do.
Yeah. If you look at the early theories of desire that we started out with, like even in Aristotle, he thinks that desire, which is a translation of orexis, is the thing that makes animals basically move. So he's
Mm,
very sort of low level physiological view. He says there would be no locomotion without orexis or desire, and which he sees as a drive towards goal states. And in animals that move, it's usually to get food or to get away from some animal that's after it. He gives examples of this, even like being chased by a predator, or predation he thinks is some kind of a result of the motivational forces of the psyche. But yeah, you're right. In human beings, all of that stuff then gets um, modulated, articulated with language, symbol systems, economics, morality, religion. So even something like creativity is partly, your ability to use imagination and to play with representations, but it requires this kind of goal state drive as well, just sort of repurposed or put in a certain direction. So
mm,
instead of just moving you through your environment, you're moving through, cultural space or intellectual space. You're getting further in the argument than you got before in philosophy, let's say. You're getting further in, achieving beauty or in the arts or creativity. So it's still the same system, but it's just very different human beings.
Yeah, and then I mean, Schopenhauer's other topic was aesthetics and beauty,
Right.
which is very interesting for someone who's talking about the will and this sort of basic drive out into the world. And then on the other hand, how does beauty work and why do we want beauty and how is beauty achieved? They seem so far apart, but once you get into these cultural factors, we're talking about what humans do on top of their biological things. Uh, I think you have to go there. You have to think about what are the grand plans of the human race, and we talk about hedonism, but there's also something that feels at least sort of transcendent or uh, more than just consuming a drive about art. There's something richer to it. It feels richer,
Yeah.
even though, yeah.
And that's where let's use that to maybe bridge to have a discussion of Damasio's new book, which is
Uh-huh.
making this argument that the story of culture and the human mind has been lacking this emotional or affective discussion. And in a way, our own project is in keeping with Demasio. Like we're taking Demasio and Panksepp seriously, and I'm happy to say that we have sort of Damasio's blessing on our book that's coming out next year. But his new book is an exciting sort of fusion of what he knows as a neuroscientist about the emotions, and then things like art and music and what we're about as a sort of species. So maybe we could talk about this a little bit. I grabbed a couple of quotes from the book, and maybe we could just riff on them a little bit. He says, quote, "Life comes equipped with a precise mandate. Resist and project life into the future no matter what." And here he sounds, he's sort of talking about conatus and the sort of Nietzschean, like you
And
were
the
talking
will.
earlier, yeah, and the will, basically. And he says this is going to be true at the unicellular level, all the way up to human beings.
Hmm. Yeah, and he goes a little bit farther than in the past. This is something I really admire about him as a thinker is that he builds, he changes
Right.
across books.
Yeah.
So now his view has changed a little bit. If you recall his earlier books, he hadn't really engaged with the brainstem and stuff, and then he got into Panksepp and other important people, and then the next book he said, "Oh, the brainstem is where consciousness in the self is." And now in this book, he's
He's
getting
lower.
even deeper, even lower. Now he's talking about the
Yeah.
gut-brain connection, and he's talking about homeostasis as homeodynamics. And he's saying it's not only to get to some normal plateau, it's also flourishing. That's what I thought is very exciting. He says homeostasis is trying to get the organism to flourish.
It's not good enough just to survive.
So
We
sort of
want to flourish as well.
that's what
Survive
he's saying.
well.
So, yeah.
That's exciting. Yeah, that's very. I mean, you make a very good point about his work in general. Like he's kind of made his name originally talking about that. In the frontal areas, there's a kind of somatic marker that tags your experience with a kind of emotional valence or something, and that codes your experience. But then, like you said, he's going deeper and deeper in the brain to older and older brain functions to show, well, your notion of the self is way down in the old brain, and now the gut is responsible. How is the gut responsible? Like, is it tilting you? Is it giving valence to things?
Well, interestingly, if you recall, do you recall the Oliver Sacks article before he passed away? He was in the hospital and he felt, was it him or was it that other doctor? There's another doctor who's a great writer who went to the hospital and he realized he was just feeling bad. He just felt bad. And it turned out it was his autonomic system
Oh,
that was out of calibration. And the idea that you either feel good or bad has these sort of uh, not just central nervous system, but autonomic nervous system, peripheral nervous system, and maybe gut brain, like these really basically all your emotions are against the background. The background
ah,
is your body.
okay.
Then there's your brain. Then there's your self. But there's all these backgrounds upon which your present state depends and is a concatenation of.
This makes sense. That I like this idea that there's a tendency, I think, in sort of some intellectual circles now, there's a fascination with the self. This is sort of the chattering classes are interested in this interesting merging of Buddhism and neuroscience, where they say, there's no self. But what you're saying reminds me that there's a background, like let's say, call it a gut mind. I feel awkward saying gut
Rot
mind, but
gut.
you know what I mean. There's a kind of gut awareness where the system is working or it isn't, and there's a kind of vague awareness of this. And then there's, like you said, maybe there's old notions of the self which are more mammalian or animal, like this is my arm, that's my leg, I am running now. Then there's like more cognitive layers of the self, where the self is going through these narrative trajectories, where I'm talking to myself, I'm theorizing myself, and so on up the ladder. And yeah, that's one of the exciting things about his book, is he's saying whether it's music or mathematics or politics, it all has some kind of these layers of feeling that have to do with the biology of the animal.
Yeah, and he's arguing further that the reason why we engage in culture is because it has a homeostatic function for our um, mm, social organization, which is something we talk about in our book too. Um,
Yeah, you mean like even pursuing socialization with a group and forming a sort of a little tribe is partly we could tell a fairly high level story about it. Well, I want to be able to have connections for when I go for my job interview and so forth. So that's why I've, cultivated and groomed this group. But in a way, there's an even lower story, which is when you're in a social relationship, there's a sort of flow of these neurotransmitters. And in the lack of social connection, even simple things like touch and song or socializing, you feel a kind of a sense of not maybe depression is not the right word, but you feel a sense of detachment that's
mm,
uncomfortable. So that even in sort of our high level, I'm going to go to the White Sox game, later, and I have a tribe of White Sox fans. There's something deeply mammalian about just being with a group of people yelling all together, and so we have to sort of refer our cultural life also back to these sort of biological roots.
yeah, and he starts that discussion by saying when we discovered fire, what that meant is the day was longer. We couldn't do anything because there was predators and because we can't really do that much work. But we can sit around the fire and talk about each other, or sing songs, or and that's part of this culture, social cohesion that has to do with homeostasis as well, and it helps us tamp our emotions and organize our emotions. It has a homeostatic function too.
That's great. And it reminds me of this anthropologist, I think Polly Wiesner or
Wiesner, yeah,
Wiesner,
oh yeah, yeah,
and she's done work on, I think in Papua New Guinea, I'm not sure, where she spends time with people who are working all day, hunter-gatherer societies, and
right.
then when they start the fire in the evening and they sit around it, she claims that all of the conversation tilts towards specific kinds of things like
Gossip.
yeah, like gossip, basically. And her argument is this is probably, this is how you begin to understand your neighbor or your family member better. You begin to connect their behaviors with what they were feeling and thinking. And I like this idea because it suggests that even the theory of mind, which a lot of psychologists will talk about like it's a switch that gets flipped in your head. You either don't have it when you're a little kid and then you get to a certain point and you do have a theory of mind. I like this idea that there's sort of, it may be a developmental thing too, where you have to sit and gossip and trade stories. They sing songs, they tell jokes, they laugh,
Yeah,
they try to understand what was she thinking. They talk shit about people, like
right.
that, they blame people and they excoriate them. So there's a whole layer of human cognitive life that happens when you can rest and stay awake around a fire, and be safe. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and personality develops too.
Right.
We have the idea of you can have kinship bonds, but then you can have bonds based on charisma. We talked about charisma last time
That's
too,
right.
about what is it? Uh,
Well, I think this is probably, we've been at it now, I think, for an hour, and I think we've covered a lot of good ground. Is there anything else about drive or wanting that you feel like we haven't hit on that we should sort of at least touch on?
Well, I guess we haven't talked much about what happens when it's finished. So we're finishing
Yeah,
our discussion now, and the idea of satiety. Like,
yeah.
it's been an hour, but also there's a feeling. Okay, we've talked about a lot of stuff. Now it's the
Right. It's sort of like, okay, I've eaten a lot of cake. I
yeah,
should stop. And
yeah,
yeah, are we just tired now? Because my brain's been crackling for an hour. Am I just tired and want to eat lunch? So we move to wrap up. It's kind of an interesting story about because the drive is going up and up and up.
yeah, and then okay, I think that's enough, or I think, and that it's funny how we also organize a lot of our time. Like we do hour-long lectures, hour and 20 minutes, hour and a half.
Yeah,
And there's sort of this flow of like, okay, this is about time. But then there's people who take sort of uppers just to go past that.
right. Truck drivers and such,
Truck drivers and
musicians.
musicians and other people. So there's ways of keeping it going, but how long can you keep the attention? Like on a solo, there's the famous Coltrane solos that are like 20 minutes.
Right.
But and then everyone's amazed that Coltrane could hold on to the idea for that long.
But do you want to hear it for 20
If you can
minutes?
follow it,
Yeah, if you can follow it.
if
But
you're
yeah, I mean, we're
there.
both teachers. Our students start to tune out at a certain point, and it's true that there might be something about what we were talking about, sort of like the energy of the body, the gut. And I'm sort of reaching a level now of not exhaustion, but I'm getting a little tired. So it feels like now the ideas can be rounded out and brought to not a conclusion, but at least a resting point, and then we're off again. But without this conversation we just had, I probably wouldn't have thought of it that way. I probably just would have thought, well, we got to stop after a certain time and we've exhausted the topic or something. But it
Mm.
might be just we're trying to put a cognitive interpretation on what is in fact now a bodily state, which is we're a little tired.
But there's also the narrative of the beginning, the middle, the end, our
Yeah,
notions of what a work is
an
and what a
Aristotelian curve
yeah.
of the
Oh yeah,
conversation.
the drama. The drama has peaked and surged, and
Yes,
now the denouement
exactly. And
has
now,
been reached.
so let's say we've had our catharsis, and let's basically sign off until next time. And
Okay.
we invite everybody to go back and hear other conversations and stay tuned for our next one. And I think coming up, maybe next time or the time after, we're going to do a whole session on music and the emotions at some point, and maybe
Great.
get out some instruments and even play some different music too. So stay tuned for that, folks. So, okay, as usual, Rami, it was a great pleasure talking with you,
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much.
and we'll talk to you all later. Take care.